George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management. Dr. Faucheux is an expert political analyst, which is why we invited him here today to share his latest results in the Louisiana gubernatorial poll, as well as gaining his personal insights into the latest debates. Dr. Faucheux lives in New Orleans and in Washington, D.C. Please help me welcome Dr. Faucheux for coming to speak to us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Can everybody hear properly? And all that's working okay. Good. Wanted to talk some about the governor's election, and even though I have to say and we were just talking about this at the table, that the most interest I find in the governor's election and the statewide elections is here in the Baton Rouge area. When you get outside of the Baton Rouge area, the interest goes way down. And I've done some speeches recently in places outside of here, and they say, well, we want you to talk about the election, and they expect me to talk about Trump and Biden and DeSantis, and not Landry and Wilson and Lundy or whatever it may be. So there still isn't as much interest in this election as there should be and there needs to be. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that. We'll talk about voter turnout. Looking at politics in general right now, one of the things that I think is interesting, and it's happening in Louisiana, it's happening nationally, is these are crazy times in a lot of ways. But they're also very stable times and remarkably stable. And, you know, I remember we had governor's elections where, you know, numbers of the major candidates would go up and down, and one candidate did this and one candidate did that and one candidate made a mistake, and these numbers were moving around all the time. And the horse race itself was very interesting, and you had to really stay on top of it. Basically, in the Louisiana governor's race, it's been about the same as it's been for almost the whole year, obviously with Landry solidifying his base on the right, and Sean Wilson with the Democratic base on the left, and everybody else trying to figure out how to get in the middle of that and make a runoff with one of these two candidates. And just like the presidential race, you have two candidates who a lot of voters may not want to vote for the hard left or the hard right. And I'm not saying these candidates are hard left or hard right. I'm saying that's where their base is. And just like at the national level, a lot of voters don't want to vote for Trump and they don't want to vote for Biden. But they feel like that you know, the hard mega base on one side and the Democratic base on the other side makes it very difficult for anybody else to come through that. And in Louisiana, we've got multiple Republican candidates who can't break through that. So it's becoming, like I said, some of these things might sound crazy, but at the same time, there's great stability. We talk about Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump has been, I think you could say, unpredictable over his 8 or 9 years in national politics, and he's done things that are unusual. And whether you like him or not, I think people would all agree with that. But it's also been remarkably stable. I did a piece for The Advocate not too long ago, talking about, you know, how voters see Trump and how voters see Biden. And when I did the piece on how voters see Trump, I was going through the numbers, and I'm saying, well, this is just about what it was 4 years ago and 8 years ago. And it went back, and sure enough, it was just a few points here and there. So with all of the problems and issues and opportunities and challenges and scandals and this or that, things just keep going about the same. And just like the Louisiana race so far, at least as of a week or two ago, really hadn't changed much over the last 7, 8, 10 months as these candidates got in the race and started campaigning. Well, pretty much the same at the national level. So, so on the one hand, we're all waiting for big things to happen and big breakthroughs and big things to cut loose, but they don't seem to be happening. And that's kind of a big picture there. And because of that, I think there is less voter interest than there should be, at least at the state level. And again, we'll talk about that. But in the last poll that I did, and it was covered by media around the state who co-sponsored it, as well as PAR and the Urban League, the survey essentially showed what most surveys had been showing, that Landry was ahead, and that Sean Wilson was second, and that you had the other candidates from Lundy to Wagasback, Schroeder, and Hewitt, and Nelson, in single digits, fighting to break out in some kind of a way. And last March, we talked about that. Will one of these candidates break out? And in the focus over that time, a lot of it was on Wagasback, because people said, well, he's a bright guy, he'll have money, he's got connections around the state, and he would seem to be the most logical person, I think, in terms of putting together a Buddy Roemer-style campaign where you, as you get known, you impress people, you handle yourself well, and then you surge at the end. So far, it hasn't happened. And can it still happen? It's hard to say. When it hasn't happened, and now we're getting into people attacking one another, then it makes it more difficult. When Buddy Roemer did his big surge in his race in 1987, you have to keep in mind, nobody was attacking him. Nobody attacked him, and he wasn't attacking anybody else. He was given a clean shot, in effect, because nobody thought. Another pollster talked to me once. He said, this was just a few weeks before the election. He said, well, one thing I can tell you is the only candidate who can't make the runoff is Buddy Roemer. He said his vote's too low, his negatives are too high. He's just not going to make the runoff. In North Louisiana, it's not a big enough base for him. And of course, 2 weeks later, that was on its head. But so none of these candidates have had the opportunity that Roemer had, because now they're forced to defend attacks, and now they're forced to attacking one another. And rarely do you see campaigns where a candidate with 5% is attacking somebody with 4%. But that's what we've been seeing in this election. And I keep wondering, well, what's the point of that? You attack somebody with 4 or 5%, what do you hope to get out of that? Because that percentage is going to scatter all over. It's not going to go just to you just because you attacked your candidate. So I also think that, to be perfectly candid, when you're not involved in a campaign, it's easy to criticize them. And I know that's, and what I say is said with that caveat. But I think that basically most of the candidate campaigns have failed to do what they wanted to do. I think their messaging has been off. I think they've had a struggle trying to figure out, how to define themselves and their image and what they think the voters want. You have a situation here where, there's a lot of desire among the electorate for change and a lot of revulsion against politics as usual. But at the same time, the state has a governor that has a positive rating of over 50%. And the legislature, while it's not in great shape, is not in as bad a shape as I've seen it in the past. And so it's hard to get that kind of a big change movement going like we saw in '87 and like we saw in '71 and '72 when Edwards and Bennett Johnston were running, and when Buddy Roemer and Bob Livingston and Billy Tozad and Jim Brown were running to be the change candidates. So, so the race is turning out to be somewhat different than what we've seen in the past, and seems to be following more of a national model. And I just find it interesting that no matter what the candidates have done, it doesn't really seem to have helped them. I think some candidates, when they spend some money and get some recognition, you know, they might go up a point or two, but it's just not much. In the poll that I did a few weeks ago, it showed that between, you know, you take Landry out, okay, who is well known. Not everybody knows him, by the way, but he's like 78% known. But you take him out, and between 67 and 83% of the electorate have never even heard of these other candidates. And so you're sitting there saying, well, can Richard Nelson be merged, or Sharon Ewan, and, you know, all these other people, and right us back, and 2/3 to 3/4 to 4/5 of the electorate don't know who they are, you see. And the thing about it is, because Sean Wilson is the only Democrat in the race, he gets the benefit of the Democratic label among the statewide electorate. In the poll we did, it showed that 60% of Democrats were voting for Wilson for governor. Now, when we said the names of the candidates, we said Democrat Sean Wilson, Independent Hunter Lundy, and Republicans for the other one. So Wilson gets 60% of the vote among Democrats, but only 35% of Democrats had ever heard of him. So almost half of his vote was coming from voters who had never heard of him. You see, so how strong is that 60%? Well, it may be okay. You know, that vote may solidify at the end as he gets better known. I thought certainly in the first debate he handled himself particularly well, and so has had some opportunities for people to get to see him a little more. But that's kind of where it's been now. You know, to look at how this election is polarized by party. You know, Louisiana for a long time was a no-party state. Then we were a one-party Democratic state, then a no-party state, then a one-party Republican state. And but to show how things have now polarized by party, in the poll we did, 63% of Republicans were voting for Landry. And the other candidates were getting 1 to 9% of Republican votes. So he's just completely dominant among the Republican electorate. Looking at Wilson, he gets 60% of the Democratic vote, and the other candidates are getting 1 to 13% of the Democratic vote. So as the only Democrat, he's getting his party base. And among independents, but one of the reasons why Landry was doing so well, two reasons why he was doing so well in the poll. One was that he is leading in independents. And many independents in Louisiana are really conservative and effectively behavioral Republicans, even though they are registered as an independent. Now, you know, some independents are left-wing, and I mean, I'm an independent. I've been an independent for 30 years, even though when Republicans don't like the polls I do, they always say I'm a Democrat, even though I've been an independent for 30 years. And when Democrats don't like the polls I do, they say I'm a Republican, even though I haven't been. But anyway, but the point of it is you've got a lot of polarization there. Now, I think one of there's a couple of things, probably three things to watch in the election. Number one is will the final weeks of attack pull any votes off of Landry? We don't know that yet. I know some of the campaigns have polled and looked at possible attacks on Landry. But you don't just attack somebody and expect it to hurt. You have to attack it properly. You have to connect the dots. I know a lot of anti-Landry people for the last year have been talking about this child, I don't know if it's the last year, but for a long time, have been talking about this child pornography case. And, oh, it's a terrible thing, and the polls show, that's going to really hurt Landry. Then they do somebody does a super PAC does a TV spot, and they force it off the air because they didn't have the documentation for it, as I understood, why they got the TRO. And, well, is that still a viable issue? I don't know. I mean, is somebody else going to come and put that back together and do it right? I have no idea. Maybe they've already started in some place in the state at this point. But the point is that you don't just go rip somebody apart in the governor's race in the last month. You need to set the stage for that. And I think the non-Landry candidates made a mistake in waiting so long to go after it. Now, they had reason to do it. Reason number one was they didn't have enough money because to risk spending all their money attacking Landry, because the votes they pulled off of Landry could go anywhere. Didn't necessarily go to them. And secondly, none of them were strong enough or well-known enough over the last 4, 5, 6 months to be a credible messenger for an attack message. So there were good reasons not to do it. Money being one, not having the standing being another one. But the point is it hadn't been done. And I think one of the things we've been learning about politics is, when I first ran for the legislature, those are the days when, people would do attack flyers and put them out the night before the election and all that sort of thing. But the days of last-minute attack may work at some local election or something still, but in big elections, the days of the last-minute attacks they're just not very effective unless it's something new and it's so horrible that it can knock the candidate out the race. But attacks need to be vetted. They need to be tested, market tested in the market. And like, for instance, the Hunter Biden attack on Joe Biden has worked. Now, that attack's been going on now for 4 or 5 years, okay? And it's worked. I mean, a large portion of Republican voters, after Trump was indicted the first time, their response was, what about Hunter Biden? Why is it that Trump gets indicted for his wrongdoing and the Bidens don't? Okay, so the Hunter Biden situation has already been harmful to Joe Biden. Will it get worse? I guess it could. The stage is set for it to get worse, but it's already had a big impact. The other thing is the African American vote, and Wilson, of course, was beating everybody with a significant lead among black voters in the state. But one of the things that was interesting about the poll was that Landry was polling 14% of black voters in the primary, and in the runoff against Wilson, he was polling 20%. Now, that's a lot more than Republican candidates usually get statewide in a party contest. Candidates like, Republicans in the past, now I'm not talking about candidates who had minor opposition. I'm talking about, races with big campaigns and hardcore party support. Republicans would have to struggle to get 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% statewide. But so Landry has been over-polling. When I say over-polling, I mean polling more than Republican, a conservative white Republican with Donald Trump's support would normally be polling in the African American community. So the question is, does that vote come off of it? Will that 14% go down to 4? And but to do that, somebody has to do that, accomplish that. The other thing to watch in this election, of course, is related to that is turnout. And will the African American vote and the white vote, how will those turnout levels work? Because they could very well affect Landry's vote relative to Wilson's vote, particularly. And finally, it appears to me, the poll I had showed this a little bit, a glimpse of this. And I've been hearing rumors, and believe me, don't believe rumors about polls. Unless you see them, it's hard enough to take a good poll, a real poll. But don't believe somebody's rumors after they've been through 5 or 6 people. You don't know what you're hearing. But the rumors, now that I've said that, I'm going to go report on rumors. But the rumors that I have been hearing from actually some pretty good sources is saying that some of the local polling is showing Hunter Lundy is moving up. And this was sort of the post-first debate. And it looked like he benefited from that first debate more than anybody. And so it looks like he's moving up. And he has very strong support in evangelical communities around the state. And there is an increasing number of African American voters and groups that are thinking about supporting him. Many of them are between supporting him or Sean Wilson, because most of these people are Democrats. And but they feel like Sean Wilson probably couldn't win a runoff, and that Lundy may have a better chance to beat Landry in a runoff. So that's something to watch. Now, I'm not saying that's happening or will change the scope of the election, but there's some inkling to believe maybe it could be. It's just like when there was thought some months ago about Wagaspack being in a position to move up, and now I think there's a sense, well, maybe it could be Lundy who could move up. The last poll we did had him already running in 3rd place. This is before he ran any TV advertising. And I do think that the independent label is helping. In the polling we did, we found that his name recognition was very low statewide, even though he was running 3rd in the polls. And I think a lot of it had to do with saying he was an independent. That there is a constituency in Louisiana, around the country, who is so fed up with both political parties that they're looking for options. So when they see independent, it's a plus. Does that mean that's going to produce 25, 30, 35, 50% of the vote? Not necessarily. But it does mean it's a plus, just like the Democratic label is a plus for Sean Wilson until he gets into the runoff. And then it's going to be the millstone around his neck, because we can't forget that Donald Trump carried the state by over 58% of the vote in the last election. So I think some of these are the things to watch over in the state. Now, one thing I wanted to answer is a couple of radio talk show hosts and some bloggers said that the poll we did showed that John Bel Edwards had a higher approval rating than Donald Trump. And I wanted to explain what the poll really showed. The poll showed that John Bel Edwards' job approval rating was 54%. It showed that Donald Trump's personal favorable rating was 50%. Okay. So that is apples and oranges, because politicians' personal favorable ratings and job ratings usually differ to some degree. Usually not a lot, but they usually do differ. And the thing to keep in mind is, in the poll, we asked Biden's approval rating was 36%. So Trump's rating was still 14% over Biden's rating. And Trump beat Biden in the last election by about 17 points. So it's not much different than it was in the election where Trump won the state by a big margin, you see. So there's nothing weird about that. What I think some Republicans were saying is, well, we don't think John Bel Edwards is that popular, and we don't see him having a higher positive number than Donald Trump. And I think the reason is because voters aren't combining the two. They aren't looking at them together. They're looking at Trump, who the state will support in November, and they're looking at Edwards, who isn't wildly popular, but he's got a positive rating in the state. He's held up a positive rating in the state. So I think that's what's going on, and I do think that the numbers make sense. When we ask people about issues, crime, education, insurance rates, and the economy are the top issues. When we ask people to reduce crime, we found 51% want to get tough, put criminals in prison longer, and 51 to 41. And when we versus looking at systemic issues and against mass incarceration. And on the issue of growing the state's economy, basically voters were all over the place. 41% said improve the business climate by cutting taxes and red tape. That was mostly Republicans who said that. Substantial numbers also said they want to improve the state's quality of life to attract more people, which tended to be mostly Democrats. And 20% said we need a skilled workforce. So if you ask me, well, what should candidates for governor say, I'd say all three, because you have significant constituencies for all three, and they're not in conflict with one another. So I think candidates should be talking more about all three. Now on the abortion issue, let me see here. Yeah, we asked the question essentially, do you favor Louisiana's current abortion law, which essentially makes abortion illegal with, essentially makes abortion legal? Or would you like to expand the right to abortion? And 50% said expand the right to abortion, 42% said keep it the way it is. Now, that says a few things. Number one, it doesn't mean Louisiana is some big pro-choice state, okay? Because when you look at other conservative states, particularly conservative states in the Midwest, they have higher percentages who are voting for or against public referenda involving abortion from the pro-choice side. So even though Louisiana has 50%, other conservative states are in the mid-50s, the high 50s, and even in the 60s. So relatively speaking, we're still a relatively conservative state on the abortion issue. But it also means that all of these candidates who are saying that they support the law as is, they're on the 42% side, not the 50% side. And how that plays out in legislative races, the rest of this governor's race, in the runoff in this governor's race, we haven't seen, because I think most candidates are afraid to make abortion too much of an issue, because it does cut multiple ways. And then finally, I wanted to talk very briefly on voter turnout. In the 2019, 4 years ago in the governor's race, 46% of the registered voters turned out, which means 1.6 million registered voters in Louisiana did not vote. 1.6 million, 1.36 million did vote. The highest turnout was in East Baton Rouge Parish, 48%. The lowest turnout among the major parishes was in Orleans, 39%. Orleans turnouts have been pretty low recently, which of course gives East Baton Rouge Parish that much more voting power in a statewide election. Now, in the runoff, okay, what's interesting was 4 years, by the way, Iberville had the highest turnout, Iberville Parish, and St. Bernard Parish, which is still feeling effects of Katrina, had the lowest. But in the runoff, in the last governor's race, 160,000 new voters went to the polls who hadn't gone in the primary. And of those, 93,000 were African Americans. John Bel Edwards won by 40,000 votes. So that extra 93,000 African Americans who went to the polls in the runoff literally by themselves elected John Bel Edwards for a second term. He didn't get the turnout he needed in the first primary. He got it in the runoff. The black turnout in the runoff was 50%. That was up 10 points from the primary. The white turnout in the runoff was 53%, and it was up only 3 points. So you can see what turnout can do in a state election. And the same thing for Democrats and Republicans. The Democratic turnout was a good bit lower than, 6 points lower than the Republicans in the primary, and they cut that lead in half in the runoff. Now, in most recent elections, and again, in the runoff in the last governor's race, East Baton Rouge had the highest turnout at 55, St. Tammany 52, Lafayette 51. Orleans, you see, jumped way up. It went from 39 to 50. Caddo 49, Jefferson 47, and Calcasieu 44. So when you look at the voting power of East Baton Rouge Parish, when East Baton Rouge is turning out 55%, Orleans 50, and Jefferson 47, or when East Baton Rouge is turning out 48% and 39% for Orleans and 42% for Jefferson. It is expanding the voting power of this parish. And so if we could have parishes compete for higher turnout, maybe we get some higher turnout. 2015, in the first Edwards-Vitter election, in the primary, only 39% turned out, and only 40% turned out in the runoff. Now that, tens of millions of dollars was spent in that campaign. I mean, it was a big, big campaign, and only 40% turned out in the runoff. But more importantly, I like to look at the half empty. 60% didn't show up. 2007, 47% turned out. 2011, 37% turned out. Jindal didn't have major opposition, so it was kind of understandable. Now, 2003 brought out 50 to 51% when Blanco was running against Jindal. So it looks like the turnout has kind of taken a dive. Edwards was able to get that runoff turnout up last time, more successfully than we've generally seen politicians get their constituencies to turn out. So we don't know whether Democrats can do that again in this election, and we don't know whether Republicans can do the reverse in this election. So that's sort of what I had to say. I'm happy to answer questions with the caveat that they're not difficult. So.
Ron?
Yeah.
Joe Biden got 82,000 more votes than John Bel Edwards got.
Right.
And he lost about 400,000 votes.
Right.
In Louisiana. So
Right.
500,000 more people voted in a presidential election in which we pretty much knew who was going to win than voted in the governor's election that was highly competitive. How do you explain that?
Well, Jim, I think that's a great question, and I think it underlies, and if anybody's going to come up with a great question, you know he will.
Huh? Would you repeat the
Yeah, well, about Joe Biden got a lot more votes in Louisiana than John Bel Edwards did. And John Bel Edwards won, and Joe Biden lost by a landslide. The point being, the turnout in Louisiana in the presidential race was much, much higher than the governor's race. I think the reason is because in the Trump era, that we have seen so much polarization, left and right, that it's increased turnout all over the place, and it's really nationalized elections. Now, the trend to nationalize state elections has been increasing for a long time. You know, Louisiana had many governor's elections that had nothing to do with national elections. I mean, I remember when in the Edwards-Johnston-Gillis-Lawn race, I mean, nobody was talking about Richard Nixon or any of these people, and they'd say whatever they wanted to say about it. Usually it was nothing, you know. And even as most recently as getting into the Bill Clinton era, where Bill Clinton was a Democrat, but he carried the state twice, you know. So Democrats didn't want to get locked into Bill Clinton, but at the same time, Republicans had to be careful because the majority of the state was foreign, you see. But now, you know, there's been, you know, Louisiana, as a number of southern states, has realigned in the last 20 years. And basically what's happened is white voters in the Cajun Triangle have gone from being sort of kind of nonpartisan, eclectic voting patterns that vote for Edwin Edwards, that vote for John Breaux, to being a very, very conservative part of the state. The other thing that's happened is St. Tammany Parish has grown, and that's a lot more Republican votes. Even though what's interesting is in the most recent elections, Democratic candidates, well, they've just been sweeping New Orleans. I mean, John Bel Edwards got 90% of the vote in New Orleans Parish. I mean, Edwin Edwards never did that. Shep Morrison never did that, you know, a million years ago. He was the popular mayor of the city. But so there's a political polarization that's been going on, and it's based on national political lines. So when you understand that, it sort of begins to make sense that 500,000 more people would vote in the presidential race than in a state race. But a Louisiana vote in the presidential race is not as powerful as a Louisiana vote in a governor's race, because the presidential candidates don't come here in general elections, unfortunately. And so, but people are watching the election on television. So if Joe Biden or Trump or DeSantis is speaking in Wisconsin, they see it just like he would be speaking in Alexandria, you know. And but my concern is the turnout in Louisiana statewide elections is too low when you compare it to where it had been, where it should be, and everybody needs to work on getting it up. And you say, well, if people aren't excited about the candidates, they're not going to do it. And that's true, you know. I mean, but, you know, on the one hand, you say, well, you've got all this polarizing politics, and people love or hate Trump, or they love or hate that. That's all true in the national level. But you don't see that in the state level. Like, for instance, Jeff Landry, who has been generally considered to be a controversial figure in state politics, okay? And that's not, I'm not saying that in deprecation or appreciation. I'm just saying that that's sort of true. People would think he would have the higher negatives of the candidates, even though he's running first. And at this point, still the likely winner. But when you poll him statewide, he had a 50% favorable and only a 28% unfavorable, you see. So these state candidates aren't, you know, the voters aren't polarized on them. They're polarized on the national partisan and ideological breaks, not on the candidates and their personalities. And which is why somebody like Lundy may have an opportunity to kind of run up the middle and pick up some votes. Now, does that mean he could make a runoff? Well, it's going to be hard for anybody to make the runoff, other than Wilson or Landry. It's just hard. But, and is there still time? Barely. You know, the window of opportunity has been closing for a few weeks now. And so sometimes nothing ever, you know, comes to pass as you thought it could. Yes?
You're talking about how Louisiana is taking more of this national path with this race, and you also see it in state legislature becoming more
Right.
supermajority Republican. Is that working for Landry, this national trying to be the Trump guy? Is that part of why we're seeing him kind of dominate still?
Yeah, I think so. You know, and especially, you know, when you're dealing with runoff politics, you don't need 50.1 right off the bat. You know, you just need a base bigger than the next guy who's got a base, and you running first, you know. And so a candidate who can attract 30%, 35%, we had Landry at 36%, was, you know, I mean, that's sort of, you know, what you'd think of as the hard mega base in Louisiana. And it's a Trump base. It's a conservative Republican base. I'm not saying every conservative's for Landry, sure not. I'm not saying every Republican is for Landry, sure not. Almost 37% of Republicans aren't for him. But the fact of the matter is that he identified with most of the conservative groups. So he built an organizational base together. Even though it was much criticized by Republicans and Democrats and media people and pundits around the state, his getting the early endorsement was a big help for him, because it kind of mating the Republican candidate. And that was punch number one. The punch number two was Trump's endorsement. So even though Donald Trump can get 58% of the state on his own, he can't necessarily deliver, or a Trump candidate won't necessarily get that in a first primary with other Republicans in the race. But he doesn't need to get it, you see. So yes, you've got that hard Democratic base and the hard Republican base. And Buddy Roemer was the last non-Republican to be able to break through that. And even Buddy Roemer realized that wouldn't last, so he became a Republican during his term in office. But since then, with Bobby Jindal and David Vitter and all the other Republican candidates we've seen, they're building that Republican base first, and then they're going forth. The problem Vitter had was he had high negatives, and he had Republicans who were more popular than he was in the state, but he had just enough, 23%, to make the runoff. But you see, they couldn't quite get past him. And then he's in the runoff, and he gave the Democrats a golden opportunity. Yes, sir.
Based on the numbers that you showed us today, do you think those numbers will change even a little bit or at all after this past bid that we had last Friday?
Well, the thing you never want is a pollster to talk about how numbers will change after the poll is done, because polls don't, record that, and so you don't know what will happen. I think everybody in this state, me included, we have been waiting for some big event, some big breakthrough for somebody at some point. And as political junkies, we're all going to continue to wait for that event up until election night. All right. So that's a fact. Will it happen? You know, history's telling us, recent events are telling us that it probably won't. You know, and a big event would be for some, bloody like Lundy or Wagasback or something to all of a sudden move up, and they go from 5, 6, 7% to 20% overnight, and then you got a new race in the last week. Could that happen? Yes, that could happen. Another thing that could happen, I'm sure when I say this, I'll have a lot of people not happy with me, But it's very possible some of the single-digit candidates could get out the race and endorse somebody else. You know, say, well, we all can't do it, so let's get behind candidate A or candidate B or candidate C, and let's try to get them in the runoff. Now, in politics, you're dealing with a lot of egos, so you could have a meeting with all the candidates and they'd say, yeah, that's a great idea. I want to be the one, you know, and everybody will say, well, you can't be the one because of this or that. And so, you know, but I mean, there have been discussions, I know, around the state for that. Some candidates have been more interested than others, but, well, you know, but those kind of conspiracy, I shouldn't call it a conspiracy, but those kind of combinations, there's nothing wrong with a candidate getting out of a race and supporting somebody else they don't think they can win. But those kind of things rarely happen in real life. You know, they happen on TV shows and movies, but usually in real life, you know. I remember when Benny Baggert got out of the Senate race with Bennett Johnston and David Duke, and he was polling like 4% of the vote. I said, Benny, where do you think those votes are going? You know, so but he, so you know, it doesn't always make that big of a difference. Yeah.
One more question.
Yeah.
Especially curious when the race with such low name recognition, like the Republicans going after Sean Wilson, but they keep giving him name recognition. Isn't it kind of double-edged sword?
No, well, what they're doing is they want to make sure Sean Wilson makes the runoff because they feel like they will have a better chance to win, to elect a Republican if there's a Democrat if Sean Wilson's the candidate they're running against in the runoff. Yeah. Even though if two Republicans made the runoff, you'd still have a Republican governor. But anyway, that, you know, given the dynamics of the race, that's how they see it. So in their mind, they've already begun the general election. And they want to make sure that Sean Wilson doesn't pick up any of these anti-Landry votes that may free up from some of these other candidates.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.